Welcome everyone to episode number 31 of the Average Ontario Anglers Fishing Podcast. It's getting close to the end of the year now, and with fall now here, it's an exciting time of year for fishing because there's one technique that really starts to shine. Again, it's good all year, but I think in the fall it's a really good opportunity to start using it, and that is jigs, specifically vertical jigs, so more vertical presentations. We're going to get into some of the reasons why jigs can become very efficient for the fall. We have another episode coming up shortly that's going to be all about fall fishing in general, so we'll do our best to balance out the factoids and whatnot. But to get us started, we have an interesting fishing fact that Jesse's going to share with us, and we also have an exciting sponsor for this episode. We'll get into that sponsor in a little bit, but first off, let's get Jesse started with the interesting fishing fact. And we've kind of walked away from ratings, but
yeah,
do good because I'm going to rate you on this one.
All right. So I thought that we could do Loon Facts. Part 3. Are we at 3 or 4?
I'm going to give you a rating first. You get a passing grade. Passing grade.
No.
Unless you really surprise me with something.
This is a good one. Loon Facts. I'm pretty sure this is part 3.
I think so.
You guys love the loons. Ever since we changed our logo to a loon and we started doing Loon Facts, I made the mistake of saying to people, hey, if you ever see a loon, tag us in your photos on Instagram. I get tons of them. Every month,
we
dozens.
get tagged more loons than fish pictures nowadays, pretty much.
So I thought we could just we have a lot to cover today, so I thought we could just do a shorter, interesting fishing fact. And this one, I actually really like because it's not really facts. It's more about loon lore.
Ooh, okay.
Right?
All right.
Okay. The call of the loon is unforgettable. Do your own.
That
was terrible.
Loon. Yep.
So a real call of a loon is unforgettable. And it's the sound and symbol for the wilderness as a whole. And a sound that, in my opinion, it perfectly describes remote solitude. Would you agree with that?
I think so.
Yeah. So when you hear that, usually you're on you can hear it on any lake, but usually you hear that noise when you're out in the middle of the wilderness. It's interesting. The Chippewa believed that the loon's haunting cry was an omen of death.
It is for fish.
Yeah, and in some native legends, the loon is a bird of magical powers. In others, it's a messenger or a symbol of power. So I thought we could just go into some of the lore that, the loon has. The early European settlers had their own reactions when they first heard the eerie call of the loon. Now you have to think. There's not loons in Europe, I assume. Maybe there are, but not the specific kind that we have here. So when they first heard this call, the reactions were interesting. A guy named Henry David Thoreau describes the sound of the loon. This was like an old school guy back hundreds of years ago. So he said, it's the wildest sound, like demonic laughter, something like a waterfowl. So it's not a duck. It's slightly scarier.
Yes.
So that's what one guy said, one of the early European settlers. Now, the ancient Inuit of Alaska, they have actually elaborate burials for loons because they're very significant birds. And what they do is they adorn the skulls with ivory eyes. Loons are very important to a lot of different cultures. And I'm probably going to, not say this name properly, but one tribe, the Tsimshian tribe, they have a legend that loons have the ability to give sight to those who are blind by taking them to the bottom of the lake until their vision is restored. It is said that the white banding around the neck of the loon from the feathers is a white necklace of shells that was a gift of gratitude from someone whose eyesight returned. Now, these diving birds were rewarded for being able to dive, which is interesting. Now, these tribes had theories as to why loons were water birds. And I thought I could just read one of them. And I'm not going to put this in my own words. I'm going to read this verbatim because it's very interesting. So it says, in her book, The Common Loon, Spirit of Northern Lakes, Judith McIntyre summarizes a legend that tells why. The legend tells about an earlier time when loons lived on land. The loon was so tame yet clumsy that it annoyed all the villagers as it ran in and out of the wigwams, knocking over belongings and spilling food and drink. The Micmacs could finally stand it no longer. They caught Loon and threatened to throw him into the water. Thinking quickly, Loon begged them not to throw him in the water, but to throw him in the fire instead. Smart. Thinking they could finally get even, were sure to throw him into the water. When he was safely away from the village, he called back to them with his wonderful laugh, saying, "Just what I wanted, just what I wanted." So that's what they're saying when they're going, "Woo! Just what I wanted." And that is how the loon became a water bird. So I don't know if that's the actual reason, but that's an interesting reason. So that's an interesting story from that tribe of Aboriginals. So very interesting. So I thought I'd just end this little segment by saying I love how the Aboriginals, they have stories and legends which are about, all the different animals, and they're so deep with meaning and significance. And our legends that we come up with are so lame. So I just thought of like a typical one. So they're like, oh, this loon helped this old man revive his vision by bringing him to the depths of the lake and blah, blah, blah. And we gave him a necklace of shells and all this stuff. And they're like burying them with, jewels in their eyes and stuff. And we're just like, hey, let me tell you, son, about the legend of the loon. We called him Minnow Duck because I dropped my glasses in the lake, thought he was a duck, then I saw him eat a minnow. That's the legends of here. So I'd have to say I much prefer the other legends that are actually written.
So bad.
Oh, I know. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. Whenever I see a loon now, I'm just going to, whenever I hear him do that eerie call, you just know that he's saying just what I wanted. So I thought that was an interesting, it wasn't really a fact per se, but I always have been interested in the native, the stories and the culture. It's very interesting. And the way that they respect animals and their environment is amazing. And it's something that we
respect the land gives back. So thank you very much, Jesse.
You're welcome.
I said I was going to give you a grade. I'm going to say that's a B+. That's good.
Just what I wanted. Woohoo!
So, jigs. We talked before about, I actually brought a box of jigs here. So we're going to go through a variety of different ones. Some of the ones, just to get started, that we're not going to talk about too much is, for example, bladed jigs. So chatterbaits, if you're interested in those, there's a huge podcast about those. They're primarily a cast and retrieve bait. They can be jigged, so if you can use them in the same techniques we're going to talk about today, but we're not going to be focusing on bladed jigs.
We'll put the full link to that in the show notes below.
Yeah, I will give a hint as to our sponsor. Well, it's not a hint, I'll just tell you who it is. Jacked Up Jigs. He's giving away some of these awesome products. They're really well tied, really well made. So he has the giveaway for those. We are going to be talking about bass jigs, because in the fall time, the reason why I was saying before about jigs in the fall is a really good opportunity, because as we know, fall fishing, we're going to get into a bit more on the next episode as well, but metabolism slow down and fish, they're not as active oftentimes because the water temperatures are colder. And so moving to a presentation that is more vertical, or you cast out a jig and you work along the bottom, it's a pretty slow retrieve. You're not just like cast out, retrieve, cast, retrieve. So it gives these fish more time to be able to locate and eat that bait. And you can spend a lot of time. Some of these things are oftentimes will pick up a jig right off the ground, just it's sitting there.
Yeah.
So being able to do so in the fall is really good to be able to use jigs, because it's such a slow presentation. And also the fish generally are deeper in the fall, or not in as much shallows. So they're holding to further underwater or deeper structures. And jigs really shine around those areas because, again, they sink. All jigs sink. Except for, they're called floating jigs. They're not really jigs.
Yeah.
But they do have their purpose. But again, that's another one we're not going to talk about today just because it doesn't really fit with our theme. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the basic jig. Like, this is just a ball head jig. This one has some wear and tear on it, as you can see.
It's hit a few rocks.
And what would be the most classic trailer for a ball head jig?
Like a 3 or 4 inch Mr. Twister.
Yep, that's exactly what I have here.
Yeah,
these are the Mr. Twisters. The bag got bad, so I put it in a Ziploc. But classic, you keep the tail up, you just loop it on over top of the hook, put it over the hook keeper, and there you have a clumsy guy trying to talk into a mic and do something which he can't do. So that's the most classic jig, I would say. And what would you primarily use this for? Because there's still work today, but what would, when you see this, what do you think of?
I think walleye.
Walleye.
Yeah. Or pickerel, as some people call them.
Yep, I agree. I will say this, despite being very advantageous for walleye, like that's pretty much, you watch any show from the 90s, early 2000s, or before, they're like, we're fishing this shoal and we're going for some nice pickerel, and like all you do is you cast on top of the shoal with one of these and you start hopping it back, like white or chartreuse, and that's nailing every single walleye on in every walleye show ever. Yeah, was this.
I think it's one of those baits though that it's kind of like, I know it's still used heavily, but it's one of those baits that it kind of, it's on the back burner a lot. Like not a lot of people use them. Like a lot of new anglers, I feel, they haven't used them.
Yes.
And it's still a bait that's very productive.
Very productive. And something, I do have a bit of story time about just the classic jig. So when I went fishing with my grandpa at the cottage, like I loved fishing. I still do, obviously. And he was an avid fisherman as well. And I would go there with my tackle box and I'd have like way too many lures, and I'd be catching rock bass and, maybe the odd smallmouth, the odd pike. And Grandpa would go there with his old rod with his 20-year-old Stren blue line on it.
Yep.
And he'd be sitting in the front of the canoe and he would pull out of his pocket a cork with like 3 or 4 different colored jigs. That was his tackle box when fishing. That's all he used at the cottage ever. And he'd just sit there, not even trailer on it, a bare jig. And I, to this day, cannot comprehend how he fished with just that. Because I've tried since, I've caught diddly squat, and he would outproduce me using a bare jig. And something about the way he did it, but he got to know that river well. And that's what he would produce fish on, is just that.
Yeah.
It blows my mind.
That is hilarious.
But there are a lot of trailers you can use for a jig. Another good one that I'll mention, so the Twister Tail, it's classic. There are a few brands, like Mr. Twister is classic. Yum, they have theirs. Z-Man has one. I've noticed it's something that not a lot of soft bait manufacturers, especially the smaller guys, everyone has a stick bait, but not all of them have just a regular grub.
Yep.
But they are, like you're saying, they're very effective. Limestone Lures, he's got these little like split tails called the Scrappy Fluke. And they're a crappy bait, but they also work really well on kind of just a regular ball head jig. But the same thing. You start it on all the same way. And even that's like a deadly little fluke bait. Just a different action. Don't have as much undulation. When we went fishing for our most recent trip, we were with Radio Voice Royce and his brother on our last camping trip, and we were fishing around these rapids for some walleye. And Royce's brother, he cast out and he's using a twister tail and a jig head because that's classic.
Yep.
He's casting it around. What did he catch? But a muskie. So when they catch anything, they literally catch anything. I've seen some of the biggest smallies of my life come up on just a ball head jig with a twister tail.
Well, remember that one day we were fishing when we were really young, and I was fishing a chartreuse twister tail down at the river mouth there?
Yeah.
Remember what I caught?
A brown?
A huge brown. Yeah. It was randomly in the middle of the summer.
Yeah.
Or not in the middle, maybe like late June or something like that. Yep. And we were just carp fishing down at a local like marina area. And I had on a 3 or 4 inch twister tail grub, and I was just casting it out, kind of like jigging it back to the end of the pier and casting it out again. And I hooked this fish, and I thought it was a sheephead, because we used to catch sheephead all the time down there, like freshwater drum. Mm-hmm. And it was fighting really deep, and I was like, 100% it's a sheephead. Comes up, it was a big brown. Not huge, but it was a girthy big lake brown. It was silver. And I was like, oh! And we got a picture of it, but that was back in like 2005. So pictures were terrible.
Yep.
But yeah, that just goes to show, like a twister tail or any like jig like that, you can catch anything on them.
Yeah. And I wanted to start off with that one because that is the classic and it's still productive today.
Yeah.
So the next one, tube jigs. So what is the difference between a regular jig and a tube jig?
What is the difference? Well, the jig head goes inside generally. Yeah.
So it's enclosed weight. And I'll ask the same question again. When you hear a tube jig, what species do you think of?
Smallmouth. Yeah.
And that's because tube jigs are imitators. Generally, a crayfish imitator is what they were originally intended for. So a jig hook for a tube jig has that again, it's much more slender. It's kind of elongated down the hook shank, but you just shove that right inside the tube jig all the way to the front, and then you can pop the eye of the hook out to the top of the tube, and then you have an internally weighted jig. You know, it's not weedless by any means, but it has a really cool fall because it's not weighted in front of the plastic. When this thing starts to drop, it actually spirals down. And we talked a bit about, Jesse had at the time it was a triple T, about the how to Texas rig a tube.
Yeah.
But you still have an internal weight system on that. And when this thing spirals down, it's a nice
so
slow
random
fall.
It's like a random glide.
Yeah. And you can just crawl these things along the bottom if you have a heavy enough weight. But the drop is what these things thrive on.
Yeah.
But they're a really good option for fishing around some sparse weeds, especially if you go back and listen to how they're Texas rigged. It really helps for the retrieval on those. You're not picking weeds off all the time. But fishing around some, mid-depth structure, these are killer for especially smallmouth because they have it's just like a crayfish imitator pretty much.
Yeah. And I mean, some guys, they use like the big white ones for lake trout. And, we've caught everything on tube jigs, pike, walleye, muskie, guys fish big 8-12 inch tubes for muskie. So like it's a technique that's worked forever, and it probably will continue to work forever. I know like some lures go in and out of popularity. Like it seems like, the Ned rig comes out and everyone's chucking a Ned rig, and then this other technique comes out and everyone's chucking that. But there's still guys fishing the tube jigs for smallmouth. Everyone's chucking drop shots, or they're doing this or doing that, and there's still guys that are like, you need to still have this in your rotation because they're effective, and they will always be effective because it imitates like a goby or a crayfish on the bottom. Like it imitates something. It looks like nothing, but it looks like everything in general, which is exactly what a good lure should do.
And I love the coloring on these tubes. This is actually from Bass Magnet. These tubes look amazing. All their colors look incredible.
Mike does an insane job. I don't know
they are awesome
how he does it, but if I did colors, it would be like black, white. That's it.
So again, like Jesse said, they're not just for bass. That is their primary use. But like I said, we've caught all kinds of different stuff on them. Again, they're huge for lake trout. Like I said, for muskie, we're not going to talk too much about the bigger stuff for muskie, but it's a whole other rig that you use with treble hooks hanging off the bottom of them and whatnot. But you can get a huge variety. I didn't bring them. I actually have micro tubes as well if you wanted to go real finesse for the fall. Because they're going slow, much slower rate of fall, generally speaking. Just a nice little morsel if they're, you're fishing. Oftentimes the weather's not as consistent as it is other times of the year. Perhaps this year's been weird, but sometimes you really want to drop it down to finesse. So that being said, you can have finesse jigs. So this one here is, I think they're 1/8 of an ounce on these, or 3/16, I think. 3/16 of an ounce. And I'll rig this with crappie jigs on it. I have even smaller ones that I'll actually have like crappie tubes, and the tubes are 1.5 inches long or 2 inches long.
Yeah.
But it's a tiny tube. But I've fished those on 16th ounce weight, and it takes forever to drop down. But there have been days when that's all that was working. It's just really dropping it down. So another thing that's great about jigs is they're so versatile. You can have something that's weighs a 1/16 of an ounce jig head to something that weighs 1.5 ounces, 2 ounce jig head if you want to get crazy. Like those things exist. But the next one that we're going to talk about, which I borrowed from Jesse, this is his last one.
Yeah. Is
the snap jig. So why don't you talk about that for a second there?
Yeah. So we went on a walleye trip this year in the spring, and you probably, if you listen to the podcast for a while, we talked about this a few episodes back, but if you're just joining us recently, a snap jig, this one's made by Berkeley. It's basically a jig head. It's kind of an arrow shape, and then it has a built-in plastic fin on the bottom, and it looks stupid. When I first saw these, they came out, I was like, that's stupid, that's gimmicky, and I didn't buy one for a long time. And I saw a few shows on YouTube, and they're like, oh, it's cool because it has a jig when you jig it up and you let go of it. Unlike a tube jig, which kind of glides and goes random places, most other jigs just drop right down to the bottom. It's like straight up, straight down. Okay, that can work 95% of the time. Unfortunately, this trip we went on, the fish were really finicky. The weather was kind of like, it was raining, it was a cold front. The only thing that they would hit was these snap jigs. And we tried everything. Our whole box of different lures for these walleye. The snap jig, the way it works is when you have a you don't want any drag on this bait. You just want it to be a straight tail plastic so that when you snap your rod up, it snaps up. And then as it falls down, it doesn't go straight down. It glides like 3 or 4 feet ahead or to the side. So it's unpredictable too. Sometimes it'll glide 4 feet to the left. Sometimes it'll go forward. And I think that just random action triggers fish because they're looking at this bait. It snaps up and then it just like swims away in the opposite direction. And they're like, no, it's mine. They grab it. So this one, it was crazy because Andrew was trying different jigs and I was smacking them on the snap jig. And I was like, man, you got to try it. You try it. Cause like I was spanking him. Like it was like 5-0. And I was like, Andrew, just try it.
I was getting very frustrated.
And he was trying to do his thing. And I've been in the same position. I'm like, no, I want my stuff to work. Mm-hmm. Finally, after I caught 5 or 6 fish, he's like, all right, give me one of those. Tied it on. And he's like, what do you do? And I was like, just cast it out, let it sink, snap your rod, and then reel up the slack. And then you'll just feel like a fish grab it. Or when you snap the rod up, the fish is already on.
Yeah.
And he caught a fish in like 4 casts.
Yeah.
And after that, that's all we fished the rest of the trip. And we cleaned up it was a really good trip. We did really well. We caught, I'd say 12 nice fish each.
Yeah.
Walleye. Yeah. It was amazing.
Yeah. Nothing huge, but the lake's not really known for massive walleye either.
Yeah. They were good. They were good either size.
Good. Yeah.
So it does look gimmicky. And I've had people say, those are stupid. You can catch them on a regular jig. We tried. It didn't work. So that's the reality of it. Sometimes you have to experiment and sometimes experimenting pays off. So definitely check those out. Highly recommended. They're a bit expensive. I think they're like $9 for 2.
Yeah.
So if you do snag up on rocks, it can get expensive. But hey, if that's all the fish are biting, I'll buy a pack or 2.
So that's really good. And you talking about that reminded me that when I was talking about the jigs, I want to talk about the different techniques to fish them. So if we go back quick to the ball head jig, whether you're fishing with a fluke on it or you're fishing a twister tail, one of my favorite ways to fish it, you can just jig it vertically like you're ice fishing. You can use these things ice fishing. You can vertically jig them off drop-offs down into a school of fish just holding the bottom. But what I'll like to do is I'll cast out not crazy far, maybe 40, 50 feet tops. But if you're fishing against, let's say it's a shoal, or towards the bank, towards an incline underwater. And as you hop up you don't need a whole big jerk on the rod tip either. Just a nice little lift, and it pops up and just comes down and sinks down right to the bottom. And you cast out, just let it sit to the bottom, and then just pop it back slowly. Because you're coming down a slope, you don't have to reel in that much slack, because as it's coming towards you, it's also going deeper.
Yeah.
So as it goes, it's a really good way to fish a variety of different depths. Once you find the depth that whatever your game fish is sitting at, you can then start focusing on that depth. But this is a really good, any jig is a really good way to kind of find that depth where they're holding. Because even if you have really fancy electronics, when fish are sticking right to the structure, the electronics aren't good enough yet to see them. Mm-hmm. You can see something, hey, there's probably something there. But if you're fishing, if you see a rocky embankment, you don't know where on that rocky embankment they might be. So you got to fish the whole thing until you can locate where those fish are holding. Mm-hmm. The other one that we talked about was the tube jigs. You fish in a similar way. I usually give a much higher hop though, just because, again, I want as much fall action on that tube jig after each hop.
Yeah. And another cool way is similar to a snap jig. It's called stroking a jig, where you cast it out really far, let it hit the bottom, and then you just snap your rod up. And your tube jig flies up like 3-4 feet in the water and then slowly spirals down. And that what it does is it obviously causes a lot of commotion. If the fish is not maybe like, within a few feet of it, it's going to be like, what was that? And swim over to investigate. And then when it hits the bottom, they go up to see it. And then when you snap the rod up, that fish just smacks it because it's a reaction bite.
Yeah.
So that's another cool technique. And you can do that with a lot of jigs, but it works really good with tube jigs because of their really cool, erratic, random gliding action on the way down.
Yes. Another bait that's similar to a tube jig. These are pre-rigged. You can get creature baits where they have an internal weight already. I find they're often a bit heavier. They don't glide as well as a tube jig does.
What is that? That's a crayfish.
Yeah, this is a crayfish here. I actually, honestly, I've had a few of these over the years. I've wanted to do well on them. I have a really hard time getting good strikes on these baits. I'm not sure why. I don't know if I'm just fishing them wrong, but my preference, hands down, is it's a good tube jig. A quality tube jig, a good hook. And again, the nice thing about these is It's generally cheaper, or it is cheaper than buying pre-rigged baits like this. And you can decide what hook you want on it. So you want to upsize or downsize, you want a thicker shank, depending on what type of brand or something you want. If you have a preference, you can use what you want best, or what's best suited for that specific bait. And it's a lot easier to change and make alterations to it than buying this. So my preference, again, these are cool, but I find they catch more fishermen than fish.
Yeah, so a lot of baits that are ultra realistic, I find. So like if you look at a tube jig and then a bait like the one Andrew has, which is basically looks just like a live crayfish. A lot of companies have those. Like they've been out for years. I know Megabass just released one, I think last year or this year, and they're like $12.99 or $12.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's cool. But I can buy a whole pack of tube jigs and a whole pack of heads for the same price. And the bass love tube jigs. Like they don't look even slightly the same as an actual crayfish, but they look enough. Like bass aren't that intelligent.
Yeah.
There may be days when you can argue that, they're so finicky that they'll only hit something that looks that good. But the proven track record of how well a tube jig works will prove like anyone wrong. Like they don't really care as long as it looks similar and it's presented in the right way. Mm-hmm. You can present something that looks absolutely real in the wrong way and a fish won't touch it. So it's more about the presentation, less about the looks.
Yeah. That's a very good point.
Because like, what does a twister tail jig look like? Well, it looks like a leech, but like if you're fishing it like in like fluorescent orange or something, like come on. So it's more about how you present the bait and how the fish react to it. It has little to do with the colors, because a lot of the most popular colors that you use for fishing, they're not natural
Find
at
chartreuse in the wild.
Yeah.
Like I personally have not seen something chartreuse be swimming around in our local waters. Unless it's by the nuke plant. But, that's a little different.
Yeah.
It's blinky. So we talked a lot about bass there. So we'll move on to the bass jigs. Bass jigs are some of the most variety you can find. They're generally all skirted. If it's a bass jig, I consider it to be a skirted jig.
Yeah.
We can get swim baits. Again, we're not going to talk about swim baits today because we're mainly focusing on our vertical presentations of the jigs. Swim baits, we did talk about them a while back about pike, and again, even we talked a little bit about them on the chatterbait episode.
Swim
jig
jigs.
episode. Yeah.
Yeah.
But bass jigs, so skirted jigs like this is a really good one. This is actually from Jacked Up Jigs. All the ones we're going to show today are from Jacked Up Jigs. So this is like a small football head finesse jig.
Yeah.
And with an upright head. So unlike the old one, it doesn't have yes, there is kind of a football shape to the head of it, but it just hasn't, all the weight is concentrated to just the head. There's no weird secondary portion of weight. These are just designed to be much more streamlined and efficient in the manufacturing more than anything. If you can fish a football head around some sand or around some mud, not saying you can't fish it anywhere you want, but a really good thing, again, this is a finesse one, but if you get a big football head, one of my favorite things to do that is just cast out, let it hit bottom, and just slowly roll it with a paddle tail on the back or something. And it's just like rummaging around, snap it up the odd time, and it just like digs into the bottom. Yeah.
They're good around like gravel and stuff. Like they are good around rocks, but you don't want to be chucking them in big boulders because anything you drag through big boulders is going to snag.
Yeah.
But the shape of the football head, it kind of like wobbles the jig as you slowly roll on the bottom, because it's not a perfect circle. It kind of like wobbles back and forth. And then when you put, like a paddle tail, or most, a lot of guys will chuck like a creature bait or some kind of crayfish imitation, because it almost looks like a crayfish like scuttling along the bottom, and it's great. And these little finesse ones, like we, the fishing world is full of videos and information from people fishing in the States where they're fishing, this huge jig and this big crayfish like trailer. Up here in Ontario, that can work, of course, but finesse jigs and small crayfish baits and small tube jigs and little Ned rigs, that's the deal. That's what guys are smashing limits on. Like, look at the huge limits they're catching out of the St. Lawrence on these small little snack craw stuff.
Yeah.
It's like 2-inch long little finesse jig, and they're catching like 30-pound plus bags.
Yeah.
Not on big baits, on small baits. And that's why that finesse jig, I actually really like it. It has a little
and
wire
it's still
keeper.
got a nice good hook on it too. Yeah. Like it's not a super finesse hook. It's smaller than the regular, on those other jigs, regular bass jigs. I think they have, a 4-aught hook? I think on those, maybe even a 5. Yeah. It was like a 4-aught. This one is probably only a 3-aught, maybe an extra wide 2. But the hook shank is still thick enough where it's still going to have a good solid hook set, because you're not using this for small fish still. You're going for your big boys still. Yeah. Just a finesse presentation. And when you tip these, oftentimes, again, because this one is finesse, you might not want to go super bulky with your trailer. So you could rig a Ned bait in the back of this, or a small craw, small creature bait would be really well attuned for this kind of jig here. But you go into your standard bass jigs, just for flipping and pitching, and you can put like the classic one is a chunk, right? It used to be like a chunk of pork rind, this pork skin that they would cut up into the shape of like 2 flaps. Yeah. And nowadays you can still get,
they still make pork. It's not as popular.
Yeah, you can still get pork rinds. You can get just the chunks, chunk baits. You can get big creature baits, beaver baits. You can put on these. You can throw, craw baits, imitators, anything like nice and a big profile. Another good option for a jig like that would be, this is also from Bass Magnet. These are the jelly shads. If you have a nice big, this is a white jelly shad, it pairs really nicely with the white jig, but that just gives a nice deep profile, a little bit of a paddle tail. Again, it's not gonna, you're not swimming this back, but you can. It's not a swim jig, but you can swim any jig you want. Yeah, there's no rules. Yeah, but if using a paddle tail still in a vertical presentation is not, again, there's no rules. You don't have to have, it always has to have constant motion if you're going to put a paddle tail on it. Fish it vertically. Guys drop shot paddle tails where it doesn't even move. It's not pulling forward in the water at all, and they're effective. So if you have baits that you think you want to try a little different, you could even cut the paddle tail off, and then it's kind of like a big beaver bait with none of the appendages, and it's just to give some more presence to fill out that profile on your jig. But again, because it's the fall, when we're jig fishing, we can have punching jigs. These are good in the summer, but as the fall comes around, there's less cover. The weed is starting to die. They can come up, and if they rot, they can create like mats and stuff. But generally, all that rotting vegetation doesn't hold fish because it's releasing so much carbon dioxide that the bait fish aren't there. There's nothing to feed on. It's becoming dead. So there's no real purpose to be around there punching. Now, every lake's a little different. Maybe that's the only cover. It might still hold some stuff depending if there's current underneath of it still. But generally, your flipping season and punching season is over.
Yeah.
But you can still fish those deeper weeds. So when you're going around a lake and you're seeing those stands of like pondweed or coontail that are still green, still like sparsely, in 10 feet of water, 15 feet of water, it can be sometimes. Fishing a jig like this, a vertical jig presentation, you can pick apart, you can stay close to the boat, and these fish, they're sitting down close to the bottom in these columns of weeds. And this is an amazing opportunity to continue with the jig fishing, because we all know the jig bite's one of the best bites.
It is.
It's always a heavy bite.
Yeah.
So don't give up your bass jigs just because summer is over. Is mainly the thing I'm trying to say.
Yeah, like
they're still effective in the fall.
It may not be effective as it was in the summer in shallow water, but when those bass slip into slightly deeper water, they might not be in 3 to 5 feet anymore. Now they're in 8 to 15 feet. What's the best way to get down in those weeds? A jig. Yeah. So it's the same technique, just slightly deeper, and it's really effective.
So big thanks again to Jacked Up Jigs for sponsoring today's episode with some of these baits. And again, you're going to be able to have the chance to win some of these amazing baits that he ties up. And if you'll have them ready for fall, there you go. Yeah. It's perfect. Because we start using them.
We originally met him at CanCast.
Yeah.
So we saw Sheldon, and his whole family was there. It was nice. His wife and his 2 kids, and they were at his booth, and he had tons of jigs, like spinner baits, bladed jigs, swim jigs, football jigs, everything. Yeah. And there was so much to do at CanCast. I kind of walked by his booth and I didn't even see it. Like, I was like, where's that guy? I said I'd come see him. And we finally found him, and he was there, and he had all this stuff, and we went into his booth, and I'm like, we spent way too much money on fishing stuff. I was like, we don't need anything. Like, literally, we don't. If you've seen our tackle boxes and our tackle rooms, we have so much stuff we don't use. But I couldn't resist because, like, I'm a big swim jig guy, and I was like, he has a really nice swim jig mold, and his swim jigs look legit. I really like them. So I picked up 3 or 4, and I was like, I don't need this. I forget what you picked up. You picked up a bladed jig, didn't you, or something?
I picked up a bladed jig, and I also picked up a couple swim jigs, I think, from him as well.
Yeah. His patterns are really good. Actually, this is one of his new ones, Fire Craw, which is like a classic. Everyone knows in the spring, like the fire craw's a really good color. This is a swim jig. I really like the head style. It's more of a compact size. It has a really big red eye on it, which I like. But one that I'm really excited. I know it's not a jig, but I want to show this out. So he also makes spinner baits. And this one caught my eye because I know we always talk about bass fishing, but this to me, this exact color too, this is going to slam pike. This is a pike spinner bait. So he has this spinner bait. The things that, as soon as I look at it, again, we buy tons of tackle. So I'm looking at it immediately. And the first things that pop out of my head, and Andrew said it too, it has the closed eye.
Yep.
So if you're pike fishing, you can use a wire leader with this and the leader won't slide up and down. You don't have to, I know you can put a piece of silicone on or like tubing, but it's already off, tied off. So you don't have to do that. It has a really, really sharp hook. This particular one, if you're listening to the podcast, it has a black head, black skirt, and then an orange flash skirt on the bottom. Yeah. Pike colors, classic. But the other cool thing about this is this particular one, for the size of the spinnerbait, which is a 1/2 ounce, it has very slim, small willow leaf blades.
Yes.
This is going to be sick to get.
It's going to run deep.
It's going to run deep. Oh, I'm really excited to use that. I'm going to put something like maybe a big black twister tail. And one thing that he wanted us to mention about this spinnerbait, which I think is really cool, because you don't see this on a lot of spinnerbaits. What do you see there?
It's a bait keeper.
Yeah, so he's got a built-in bait keeper that basically when you thread on your plastic on your spinnerbait, you spin the bait around and it gets hooked onto this screw keeper, this little coil on the bottom, and it holds your bait on. Mm-hmm. So what happens a lot is I'll have to bring super glue when I'm fishing, especially when you're pike fishing, and your skirt or your trailer will just constantly slide down. You have to adjust it. And if you fish a spinnerbait before, if your trailer's slightly off, it ruins the action of the whole bait. So the fact that he has that really, that's a pretty cool thing. I know a lot of other companies have these on their regular jigs. I haven't seen this on a spinnerbait.
Yeah.
Not that I can think of. So I like that. So once you put a trailer on, maybe you pick Z-Man, you screw that on there, it's not coming off forever. No need to have super glue with you, which is just something else that you'd have to carry, which is annoying. But I'm excited to try that for pike this fall.
That's awesome.
So
yeah, he makes some really awesome stuff.
And his website, we'll put the link to his website in the description below. He's got tons of stuff. Tons of stuff. Yeah. And he's a local Ontario company. I don't know if we mentioned that. But he's a local boy.
Yes. And he was at Handcast. So if you see him out and about, say hi. Tell him that you heard about him on our podcast.
Yeah.
So if there are a few other jigs that when you're I think fall fishing, they might not come to mind immediately for you. I know one that well, first of all, we'll do this one because this one will come to mind. If anyone fishes walleye in the fall, all through the summer and whatnot, in the spring, one of the best things around in the Kawartha area that any walleye guy will tell you is rip jigging for walleye. Yeah. And that's generally a bucktail jig. So there's a couple examples here.
Ripping hair.
This one has a trailer on it. This came pre-rigged from, I don't know where I got that. I found it somewhere, I think. And this is, Jesse brought this one in. I think this is Big Jim's.
It's a Big Jim's.
Yeah. Which I have a few of his as well. Really awesome.
It's the only bucktail I buy.
Yeah, really good bucktail
Local
jigs.
guy, ties amazing jigs.
Yep. Big Jim McLaughlin.
Yep.
Awesome guy. So for these, you fish in the same way all year round. We did talk a bit about them in the past, but you cast out, you let it sink to your whatever desired depth, and you just start ripping it through the weeds. So again, you're looking for those deeper weeds now and not deeper. Again, it's 7 to 15 feet, somewhere in that range. And that's where these fish are holding now in the colder temperatures. They're in these weeds, are waiting to ambush their prey. They're not spending a lot of time cruising around looking for stuff. And even the species that were shallow, like this, perhaps, the largemouth and stuff like that, they're coming down into those deeper weeds, and they are still ambush predators. But now they're not so much hitting topwaters because the frogs are gone and the bugs aren't around anymore. So they're still have to ambush. They still have to feed. All winter long, they still have to feed. So they still eat. They slow down. So the great thing with these is you can be ripping this through the weeds and it gets caught up in a weed. And let's say there's a fish just staring at it. And as soon as it moves again, as you rip it out, they just open their mouth and they suck it in.
Yeah.
They're right up on the thing waiting for it to get ripped out. And like, is this thing alive? And it's like, and it's on. Yeah. So it may feel like a fast presentation, but it is actually a really good one to use for the fall because it's deceivingly slow still. It's not a constant retrieve and things can keep up with it. Yes, they're not, when I say fish slow down, it's not like all of a sudden they become sloths and they physically can't move fast. It's they want to make sure that the energy they're putting out has enough reward, because it takes more energy for them to move in the colder temperatures. So if there's something in front of them, they can still strike at it fast, but they're not going to chase something generally.
Yeah.
So that's the big difference. So if they have the opportunity to have something come by, they can see it coming, they can get into position and then attack. That's a really good option. Another one that I want to talk about. So these are actually designed for the jelly shads. These big weedless jigs. But again, despite being, looking at that and saying that's a great swim jig, yes, it absolutely is. You can still hop this along the bottom. Anything that has a jig head, don't be afraid to jig it vertically, to let it hit bottom, mess around on there, pop it up. Again, it's going to be stirring up a lot of sediment. It's going to be bring more attention to itself, and it's going to be a slower retrieve than just constant. Another one, I brought a couple. First of all, I actually found some more of these. These are the offset. I think these are from Z-Man. It might not be from Z-Man, but they're for Ned rigs. So they're offset Ned jigs. So again, if you're looking to downsize, looking to finesse, this is another amazing one. And again, I like the offset ones because I can rig them completely weedless. Texas rig it right on the jig head. Another one, we have a classic marabou jig. These are really good for crappie is a big thing in the spring. These work really well in the spring. But again, if you can fish these under a bobber, under a slip bobber, you can get it down if the fish aren't moving, but there's, let's say it's a more compact weeded area. You're not trying to cover water and locate these fish. If you have a good idea where they're going to be, really slowing things down and fishing anything under a bobber, like small jigs under a slip float, can be really effective because it's just staying in the strike zone the whole time.
Yeah.
And a lot of guys think, it's spring. It's the first thing we do is we go out for crappie in the spring with some slip floats and we start fishing the shallows with this. But you can get these things to be effective all year round. But especially the fall, things slow back down again. Spring, what is it? It's cold water. They're coming out of the deep up into the shallows. Weeds are, they're not super big though. The fall, what's happening? The weeds are there. They're dying off. There's some still left. The fish are moving back to the deep water. Water's cold. Sounds like pretty similar.
Yeah.
So using some of those springtime techniques in the fall is a really good opportunity.
And that is a technique that became popular. Remember it was called float and fly? And a lot of rod companies came out with specific rods for that. They were bass rods, but they were really long, 8 to 9 feet long, light action rods. And it was basically for float fishing little marabou jigs. That's literally the technique, and it was popular for years. I know St. Croix even had one. All different rod companies came out with them. I don't think it's as popular as it was maybe 10, 15 years ago, but it just goes to show you can catch big fish on small little marabou jigs.
Yeah. And another one I wanted to mention is, we're talking about the finesse jigs. True North Baits, I was just using some of their stuff this year. I was really impressed with some of the soft plastics. So something that worked really well for me in the spring that I want to use again in this fall is their little goby, the junior goby. It's 2-inch soft plastic, and it rigs perfectly on these little 3/16 jig heads, which floats a good size slip bobber really nicely actually. And this action is just I say action, but it's because it takes nothing for it to move.
Yeah.
The really soft
Constantly
plastic
twitching around.
Yeah, I literally can't hold it steady enough for that tail to stop moving.
Yeah.
So that's stuff like that. I really, again, between Jesse and I really like fishing finesse presentations. So the fall, again, next episode, we're going to be talking a lot about fall fishing. There's 2 things, guys, ready to tell you is upsize your baits or downsize your baits. And it depends on your day, depends on the species. But if you're going for, still going for those fall bass, that's a really good time where stuff like BFS, stuff like small jigs, that stuff can become really effective in the fall because all of a sudden this fish doesn't want to expend much energy at all. There's something just sitting in front of it. It's like, oh, I'm a little defenseless little minnow. It's going to come up and it's just like, oh, it takes no effort to just swim into it and open its mouth. So they can be super effective. But that, I think, covers generally most of the jigs that are out there, the different styles. we've gone over a lot. There are a few outliers, like I have a weedless jig, but again, this is really good for, this one is more of a swim jig style for casting out weedless. You put a paddle tail on the back of this. Nice weedless jig. But I don't usually use these for fishing around structured vertical jigging, just because they're geared towards being drawn through the water. But like I said, anything can be done. I have done it, but you always want to use things that are going to be most effective for you. So there's a few tips in there, hopefully, that you've been able to pick up on. Maybe techniques that you already know but haven't thought to try this time of year. Be sure to give it a shot if you have the opportunity, and let us know if you have any other suggestions on what you like to do in the fall for your jig tactics. We do have some questions from our, what's that called? We posted a prompt.
AOA Q&A.
AOA Q&A.
Yeah, I thought we could do a few.
Instagram. Yeah.
I thought we could do a few after you talk about the giveaway.
Okay.
Yeah, before we forget.
Sounds good. So, the giveaway. Sheldon from Jacked Up Jigs, he has come through for you guys big time. Again.
Big time.
So
he has jacked up the prize.
And if you like it, then he's going to jack up his prices. No, his stuff is again really well made, good quality. You're going to spend more on something like, ooh, look, an evergreen jig, but he puts his heart and soul into making these things be good too. So
yeah,
for
they're
much
good.
less.
We bought a bunch this year. We've had success on them.
Yeah.
I like his patterns. His quality is very good.
Yeah.
And again, he's a local Ontario guy. So if you want to give him some business, I highly recommend it, because look at Andrew's shirt. Support local tackle shops.
Yes.
Do it. And tackle makers. Sheldon's not a store yet. Anyway, what's the giveaway?
So the giveaway, it's going to be a variety pack. So there's different sizes, different colors, different styles of jigs, and they're different weights, so running different depths. It's a great kind of
a surprise.
Not even a starter pack, but it's just a really good variety that's going to cover whatever you like to do, whatever you want to get into. There's going to be something in there for you.
Yeah.
Its value is $150 before tax value on this giveaway.
Wow.
That's huge.
That's a big.
So it's like $200 of value that he's just going to give away to.
And he's going to ship it right to your door.
Yeah. You don't have to leave to your local tackle shop. Still do, but you don't have to for this one.
Yeah. That's awesome. We like to thank Sheldon for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
We are happy to meet him at CanCast, and we're hoping that he comes again next year so we can see him again. So definitely, if you come to CanCast next year, definitely drop in and say hi to him. Super nice guy.
Yes.
Most of these guys are. I know we always say, oh, they're so nice, but he's actually a really nice guy. Him and his family were there. It was really good to see them. So yeah, so I thought we could do some AOA Q&A. Oh, and before we say that, to enter this giveaway, the only way to enter, we always say this every time, the only way to enter is to follow us on Instagram at Average Ontario Anglers, and we will post the giveaway the week that we post this podcast. So make sure you put on your post notifications. So when we post that story for the giveaway, you can be one of the first ones to enter, because it's a limited time entry. It's like 2 days. That's it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sometimes it's 1 day. Anyway, I thought we could do some AOA Q&A, and I'm just going to go through these, and we'll pick ones that, I think Andrew would like to answer. So here's, I catch dinks. Love that guy.
Yep.
Best snack / lunch out on the water. I wouldn't say best, but what do we always do?
Can of chili.
Can of chili. It'd be like October, we're trolling for muskies, catching absolutely nothing, and I'm like, well, lunchtime, pull out a can of chili, eat it cold.
Yep. If you get, now I've tried to take homemade chili, but the fat that goes on top of it I can't get past it.
Yeah.
But if you get canned chili cold, there's no like balls of curdled fat on top of it, so it's actually good.
If Radio Voice Royce is listening to this, he's gonna roll over.
He's
dead.
Shaking his head right now. I can guarantee it.
Okay, so I wouldn't say that's the best snack.
Food is important, and we're just like, bare minimums.
One of my favorite lunches is a really good sandwich, like on a good bun, like a big cheese bun, and I'm talking like a big like roast beef sandwich with a big hunk of onion and lettuce and tomato. Like I just love a really big sandwich. I don't like anything. It's nice to have a hot meal. But if you're fishing in a small boat, it's like, I'm not going to bring like a stove in here, like heat this up. So for me, a really good sandwich is something that, you look forward to. It's like, when you're working, right? You work hard all day and it's like, you're just looking forward to lunch because that day you have a really good sandwich and you're like, it's the small things to look forward to in life to make you happy.
Yeah.
So a sandwich, I'd say that.
Now, speaking of sandwiches, I don't know if we talked about this before on the podcast, but I remember Justin and I were fishing, we were camping one time, and he was like, I'm going to make our sandwiches for fishing out in the boat later. And it was like, oh, what? Like, like, how do you want? And we're gonna have peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Yeah.
And he's like, how much do you want on it? I'm like, oh, make it thick. I want it thick. And so all of a sudden, like we're out fishing. It comes like lunchtime, whatever. We're gonna eat our sandwich. I'm like, hey Jesse, toss me that sandwich, and he tosses it to me, and he hits me like a brick. And I'm like, what the heck? And I look at this thing. I take a bite out of it, and inside, I kid you not, is like 3/4 of an inch of jam and 3/4 of an inch of peanut butter.
Yeah,
it is the fattest sandwich I'd ever had. This peanut butter and jelly, and now it's become like tradition for me. Where I will go. We go camping. It's like, I'm gonna bring a loaf of bread, and I'm gonna buy
a whole jar of
peanut butter and a whole jar of jelly, and that's not coming home with me. I just like make those sandwiches thick.
I always tell Andrew I like my peanut butter sandwiches like I like my women, thick
with 3 C's, thick.
Speaking of sandwiches, just briefly, I have a sandwich
that smells good. I can smell it from here.
Oh, okay.
And I'm hungry now.
So this sandwich is a big full-size rye bread, and I got big chunks of red onions in it. I pickle my own jalapenos.
Oh, they're so good.
They're so good. But these ones I didn't do in circles. I cut them into strips. So it's strips of jalapenos in there with Black Forest ham. Oh, mustard and mayonnaise.
I'm salivating right now.
Oh, so good. This Subway has nothing on this. Anyway, we're going to switch. That was a good question. Right. This is a really good one right here. This guy asks, if you were to build... Sorry, this is Angelo. If you were to build... No. Aww. If you were to build a bass tackle box for someone getting into the sport, what would it be? I know we kind of always go over this because like I used to work at a tackle store and people do that all the time. They'd be like, hey, buying something for my son or my dad or my, boyfriend, and they're just getting into fishing or they have a cottage trip coming up and they'd be like, I have $100. What do I buy? And it would always be the same thing. I'd be like, where are you fishing? Are you fishing for bass? They're like, I don't know. I'm like, okay, it's bass. It's a cottage, right?
Yep.
In Ontario. So it would always be for me, it would be like, as much as I could fit in for $100, it would be a pack of stick baits, like yum dingers, a pack of hooks for those, a chatterbait.
Yep. I would 100% be putting a chatterbait in there.
Yep. A topwater, usually like something just like a whopper plopper or something. Or just a straight retrieve. Yeah. Something easy. And then usually Mep spinner, size 3, size 4, like a Agley Long or...
I love the egg. For me, it would be an Agley Long 3 silver. That was classic.
I would just keep it super basic. And if you're fishing weeds, definitely throw in like a weedless frog. We've been actually really big.
I'd definitely putting in a crankbait in there as well. So for me, it would be like a rattling wrap.
A lipless
crank.
Yeah, versatile.
Or another one would be a nice like square bill, like the cotton cordels. They're not expensive, but they work really well. Those square bill cotton cordels.
Yeah. All you have to do is when you're at the tackle shop, like all the guys that work there, the guys and girls that I worked with over the years, the majority of them were very knowledgeable. They fish themselves. So just ask them, be like, hey, what's the easiest lure to catch bass on? Guaranteed they're going to pick out some of the baits we just talked about.
And that's another thing too, that why we really like local tackle shops is because the people that work there are working there because they have a love for fishing. I don't think I've ever gone into a tackle shop and the person on the counter, it's either like in the family, right? So it's either like the person's kids or whatever is behind the counter. But again, they have knowledge because they've been working in the shop their whole life. It's what they've known. Or it's people that are like they have a love and a passion for that. That's why they wanted to work in a tackle store. Whereas I find if you're going to just a tackle section in a big box store,
they don't know anything.
They that's where they got assigned. They didn't like, I'm going to be in the tackle sections. Like that generally doesn't happen. So if you want to, going to an actual tackle store, being like, hey, do you have any suggestions? They're more than willing to help you out. And if you let them know where your budget is and like, look, I need the most bang for my buck, they'll help you out for sure.
Yeah. So that we could just do one more and then next week we'll do the rest of them.
Sounds good.
Okay. So Jay Matthew, he asked this question. He says, tie line directly to lures or a snap swivel or a snap swivel? Pros and cons. And then he says, love the podcast. Yeah. It depends. I've gotten to the point where, like, say if we're going, like on that walleye trip we were talking about earlier, I have a jerkbait rod with a snap on it because I'm going to be switching jerkbaits and tying a swim bait on this. And I'm a habitual lure changer. I like to change until I find something that works. So if you're doing that, I'd use a snap. But if I'm fishing like a jig or something that has a little bit more finesse to it, I don't want that extra snap there. It can also like pick up weeds and stuff. If you're fishing with any lure that rotates, possibly like a spinner
Yep.
or a spoon.
And a ball bearing swivel.
You need a
Not
ball
just
bearing swivel.
Ball bearing swivel. Worth the money.
Yeah, any lure that does that, I would definitely use a ball bearing swivel. And yeah, I know a lot of people.
That being said, if we're using a spoon, again, spoons, if you're retrieving it properly, shouldn't spin. So let's say we're shore casting for salmon, we're using spoons. We just tie directly to the spoon.
Yeah.
Or to a snap ring.
But if you put on a
ring.
small swivel on a snap, it's not going to make that much of a difference. I used to be like, oh, I'll never use a snap, but like it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But yeah, I you always go fishing with people and they're not avid anglers, and you'll see they'll have like one of those big brass snap swivels and they'll have just like a little jig on it. I'm like, what are you doing? But you still catch fish on it. But if you're trying to finesse, I would not use a swivel.
Yeah. For my BFS rod, for example, I generally don't use any snaps on it just because on those small baits, it really affects the action. Like Jesse said, finesse presentations. Any jig fishing, I like to tie directly to the jig just because I find it's less, the line will then come off that hook eyelet, always at the same point pretty much. They won't get like a snap might spin around, or the jig head, because they're filled with oftentimes paint and whatnot, it's really tough to get that snap through, and you're bending it out and misshaping that snap, and there's more likelihood of it opening up later.
Yeah.
So if I snap something off, I don't buy cheap swivels. I usually will buy ball bearing swivels, or I'll get really high quality snaps because I want to be able to trust them.
Yeah.
So if I'm fishing a jig, I'm not going to put on a snap that costs half the price of that jig, knowing that I'm going to probably snap it off on a rock.
Yeah, it's true.
So, but most of the time I do have a snap of some sort. I only use a swivel if I'm fishing a spinner pretty much, that is actually going to be rotating. But other than that, it's I usually have a snap on most of my equipment, except for those exceptions I just talked about.
Yeah, and I think that's a good tip about replacing snaps. So one thing, if you do use a snap, don't get lazy and use the same snap for weeks or months. Replace that snap every time you go fishing. Snaps are not expensive. If you buy like top quality snaps, it's a few bucks for a pack of like 10 of them. Every time you go fishing, take that snap off, put a new one on, because the constant opening and closing of that metal, they're designed to bend a little bit, but they won't handle that over time. And you don't want to snap off a fish on a broken snap.
If you find you just had to I have to rebend it so it stays locked in, automatically that should tell you
cut it off,
replace it,
get a new one. It's
worth it that time, because if the next fish you catch is their biggest fish, it's your personal best, and that snap fails, you're gonna kill yourself. You're gonna hate yourself for it. You know?
Yeah, and the snap would cost 50 cents to replace. So anyway, that's a very long story too. The answer is sometimes. So anyway, we'd like to thank Sheldon again from Jacked Up Jigs for sponsoring this episode.
Yeah.
It's a very jiggy episode.
Yeah.
I said to Andrew that he should learn get jiggy with it, but he said no. So
I really like Will Smith, but I don't feel like I like his songs and whatnot. People say, "What's your favorite rap artist?" I'm like, Will Smith. They're like, "Wow, you're white." I'm like, I am. But thank you very much again for listening. Thanks again. Huge thanks to Jacked Up Jigs for another awesome giveaway. So everyone stay posted for that again. Follow on our Instagrams. Look at the stories. Take note. That's your opportunity to be able to win this awesome giveaway. If you have any questions, you can always hit us up at our Instagram at Average Ontario Anglers. Jesse has his own personal one. I have my own personal one as well. If you're looking to contact us directly on Instagram, you can always message us on those as well. But we're always happy to talk to our listeners. No, I was going to say fans, but I don't want to assume. I'll just say listeners, because if you're hearing this and you talk to us, that's what you are.
Yep. So quote of the week?
Quote of the week. That's your responsibility.
Okay, so my quote of the week is, just what I wanted, just what I wanted.
Woo!